All right, well, I think we're at critical mass. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm Kirsten James, the director of the water program at Ceres, and it's terrific to see so many partners tuning in today. As you know, we'll be focusing on the themes of soil health, water stewardship, and the Ceres WWF AgWater Challenge. So first, just a few logistics before we dive in. Please remain on listen-only mode for the duration of the webinar so we don't get any background noise. And we encourage you all to type questions for our speakers and panelists at any point in the chat box. You'll see that at the bottom right of your screen. We will be having a Q&A at the end, so definitely keep your questions coming and we'll try to get to as many as possible. And just a note that the session will be recorded, so you'll be receiving a link to the recording shortly after the event. We have a terrific group of speakers joining us today. First, Ceres and WWF will provide a bit of an introduction to some of our recent research and trends that we're seeing around water and agricultural supply chains. And then we'll focus on efforts around the Ceres WWF AgWater Challenge. Then we'll dive into a panel discussion to really get at the merits of implementing soil health practices and nutrient management to really further water outcomes within agricultural supply chains. And then last, as mentioned, we'll save some time for Q&A. So we hope you leave today's discussion with some new ideas and strategies on how to collaborate and engage around these topics. So first, I want to take a few minutes to share some highlights of recent research that has really informed our thinking on the road to sustainable agriculture. So every 2 years, Ceres undertakes an analysis that we call Feeding Ourselves Thirsty. Next slide, please. To better understand company progress on assessing, managing, and disclosing their water risks. The third edition of this report was released this past October. And obviously you can dive in much more deeply on our website, but today I just want to share a few trends in the report to set the stage for the discussion. So within the report, the basics are that companies are assessed on a 0 to 100 point basis across 4 sectors and across 4 key categories of water risk management. And we focus on company decision making and moving to supply chains as well. So next slide, please. So as you look deeper at the findings, just here are a few overall highlights. So as you can see here, as we break down the average scores by industry, we do see scores heading in the right direction. Over time, the last 3 issues of the report, we do see that scores are improving. And there definitely are leaders in the pack. However, as you see across the board, there is much room for improvement on that 0 to 100 scale. Next slide, please. The report found that more companies now assess water risks not only in their facilities, but also in their agricultural supply chains. So that's a great trend that we are seeing. Specifically, since 2015, the proportion of companies assessing water risk to both their own facilities and their supply chains has jumped from 35% to 67%. However, it's also important to note that many assessments still fail to account for risks other than water scarcity. Risks such as agricultural runoff, impaired ecosystems, regulatory risks, concerns of local stakeholders, for example. So many of the companies are lacking these key pieces. Next slide, please. And then very germane to the discussion today, we dive more deeply into sustainable sourcing commitments within the report. And here, when we unpack the data, we find that 63% of companies have at least one goal in this area. So that's up from 41% back in 2015. Yet what this also means is that 37% still lack goals to source crops in ways that reduce impacts on water use and water quality. Additionally, as we dove deeper, we found that existing goals often lack clear definitions, implementation plans, and importantly, they're lacking measurements of progress. Next slide, please. And of course, it's just one thing to set the goal, but companies can really make progress towards the goals by supporting farmers in their supply chain. So the report looks a bit at this as well. And we see that a strong majority, 70% of companies, are providing educational support to their growers. But within this, it's important to know that less than half are providing any financial support to growers. So financial support meaning premiums or lump sum payments, but also things like low interest loans or discounts on inputs, for example. Also of important note for today's discussion, while more companies are now collaborating to address challenges at the watershed level and undertake collective action, the analysis shows that the majority still lack these watershed, more holistic plans. Next slide, please. So this year, after feeding ourselves thirsty, we decided to take a deeper dive and really look more closely at what makes a strong sustainable sourcing commitment. So we conducted an assessment with our partner, the Meridian Institute, and Robin from the Meridian Institute will share some more key findings during our panel discussion later today. But I'll just share a quick overview of what we did, and of course you can find the full report on our website if that's of interest. So the analysis explores some of the unique factors associated with U.S. row crop production and specifically water quality outcomes. We conducted an extensive group of stakeholder interviews, 27 interviews of companies and other stakeholders to help inform this work. We explored the breadth and strength of different company commitments to really address environmental sustainability concerns in their agricultural supply chains. And as you see here on this slide, these commitments tend to fall into these three main categories. The analysis outlines options and best practices for companies working with their supply chain to reduce nutrient sediment loading, and the analysis also provides recommendations for those who are looking to develop and implement strong commitments to improve water quality outcomes. Next slide, please. So a high-level finding from the analysis that probably seems very obvious to some, but it's very important to note, is that companies increasingly are making public commitments to sustainably source commodities and raw materials, but it is so essential that these commitments are strong, have measurable progress plans, and then truly lead to those beneficial water outcomes, and you can measure against those. An example of a corporate commitment framework that really surfaced through this research is shown here on this slide. This is a framework that really rose to the top as one that could further water outcomes and also could be more immediately implemented. So with this and the research I just shared, this has really provided some foundational thinking to the new focus of our AgWater Challenge and our efforts moving forward. So with that, I want to turn it over to my colleague, Nicole at WWF, to dive in a bit deeper and share more specifics about the challenge. So Nicole, over to you.
Thank you, Kirsten. Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Tanner. I'm the manager of the Freshwater and Food Transformation team at WWF US. I've been working on the AgWater Challenge with Ceres since 2016. And when WWF and Ceres originally were thinking about what we could do together in this space, it was really centered around this understanding that there is a significant gap between awareness and action for companies addressing water in their agricultural supply chains. I think some of the statistics and research that Kirsten just presented really speak to that fact. And we were, what could WWF and Ceres do? That's how the AgWater Challenge was born. We created the challenge, launched it in 2016 as a mechanism to help close that gap and provide a platform for companies to make more transparent commitments and to better steward freshwater resources. Next slide. Through the 2 rounds that we've done on the challenge, we've had 9 companies representing over $264 billion in annual revenue make progress on more than 20 new commitments. And these new commitments were spanning the original 5 ingredients for good ag water stewardship that were the core of the challenge. And those 5 ingredients really focused on everything from foundational assessments and prioritization of geographies and commodities for ag water action, as well as goal setting, policy creation, and then implementation in the fields and in the watersheds. Next slide. And through since 2016, through those 4 years, we've learned a lot. We've heard a lot from the participating companies about their lessons from implementing the programs in order to meet their commitments. And those lessons were both successes. How were we able to leverage our supply chains and partners to improve water outcomes in agricultural production, as well as some barriers or challenges. And so they've been very candid in sharing these stories. And we've summarized the 5 most common lessons learned in our forthcoming as of today on our partnership website in our 2020 progress report. And they're included here on this screen. When we think through what do we need other companies to know about how to better address water in agricultural supply chains, we've learned that you need to stop talking about it as a separate issue. Although we wanted to elevate the sustainability issue of water stewardship, and to do so, maybe we had originally thought, let's keep it separate. We learned that the way that supply chains are structured and the conversations that have happened and are continuing to happen, they're not single issue conversations. And so you need to have the conversation with farmers, with suppliers on sustainability issues that really address all of the different outcome areas that they should be. So from a business perspective, from a yield perspective, it's not just water, but water as it relates to a lot of these other issues. We've also learned that to implement projects, going it alone has never been and will never be the way to make scaled progress at a landscape level. And so you need to find partners, and there are a variety of ways that you can do that. Our report talks about how some of the participants have had success finding partners for implementation, both based on proximity, so you're both in the same watershed, or by finding those that have common shared challenges or have shared influence along key parts in the value chain. We also found along the same line as the first one is that corporate language doesn't really help when the conversations, especially when it comes to making the business case with farmers. The business case at the corporate level is not the same business case as it is with farmers. And we really need to talk about these co-benefits and how they're going to be implemented, how they're going to be measured, as well as who's going to help the supplier or producer make the changes that are being requested. Because sometimes the return on that investment is in the medium to long-term horizon. And that brings us to our last 2, is that one way or another, these practices, changing of programs, changes of approaches, new analyses, they need to be funded one way or another. So the report looks at a few different examples of how participants have been able to fund these kinds of efforts. And lastly, we recognize and we have heard from participating companies that are engaged in many platforms globally that measurement does not automatically lead to improved outcomes or even impact. And that's where the idea of adaptive management really comes into play. You need to understand what the numbers are telling you and if they're helping you meet your goals, and build in time for reassessment and modification of your sustainability approaches in order to meet those outcomes. And that's especially important for water, as a one-size approach does not work in all cases. Next slide. This is what you'll be looking for if you visit our website for the 2020 progress report. We want to thank all of our participating companies for sharing their progress on the commitments that they made through the platform, as well as allowing us to aggregate their lessons learned into those 5 key points we just shared. Next slide. And so as such, and also building on the Ceres findings that Kirsten just presented, the AgWater Challenge in 2020 is going to look a little different. We would like, so looking toward the future, we want to make sure that we're overcoming these barriers. And as such, we've simplified the AgWater Challenge to purposely do that. We've honed in on the core sustainable agricultural principles that deliver water outcomes, and specifically those that emphasize soil health and nutrient management through practices that improve both of those. And this is because many of those also deliver co-benefits, specifically on carbon, which is very much at the core of the business case for sustainability these days. And what we're really asking is to provide details on some key things. So on the next slide, we look at what this commitment language might look like for 2020 and what we're recommending. You'll see here a few things. In 2020, we're going to challenge companies to articulate where you will be applying these principles and asking for change in practices, and specifically how they account for water outcomes, how they deliver water outcomes. We will then ask you how this approach, how in this approach you are going to support implementation either directly or indirectly with those farmers and at the watershed level. And this does a few things. Next slide. This approach supports companies engaging their supply chains in a meaningful way by using language that the farmers know and trust, that builds on corporate sustainable agricultural ambitions, which include water but may not have water as a standalone component, but still emphasizes the pathway for improved water outcomes, and that's important. So we're very happy for and excited about regenerative agricultural programs or sustainable agricultural programs being bolstered moving forward, but we don't want to lose the attention and measurement for water outcomes, especially in places that experience high water stress or commodities that pose a threat to those ecosystems. And over the coming year, we plan on working with companies to understand how they might be a part of the AgWater Challenge so that we launch later this year. Now, with that in mind, I'm going to turn over to our colleague, Beth Hooker at Ceres, who will lead our panel discussion. Thank you all.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Kirsten and Nicole, for providing that great foundation, history, and details for the new AgWater Challenge. My name is Beth Hooker, and I'm a Senior Manager in Water and Agricultural Resilience at Ceres, working alongside our partners at WWF. It's such a pleasure to be here today to moderate our panel with expertise and perspective from multiple areas of the food and agricultural world. During today's panel, we're going to focus on some of those areas that Kirsten and Nicole were highlighting as part of our new AgWater Challenge to get these perspectives. So the areas we're going to be looking at are spurring the adoption of locally relevant sustainable agricultural principles that improve water-related outcomes, emphasizing soil health and nutrient management practices. We're also going to nest this into the idea of working in high-risk watersheds. We're going to look at the importance of support for farmers and suppliers, both from a financial and technical incentive perspective. And then we're going to look at ways to encourage collective action, including policy engagement, to ensure that these implemented principles and practices will lead to the intended results. Now, we asked our panelists here today to help us provide color and perspective, and we're delighted to welcome them. And so I will first say who everyone is. You can see their pictures and them in person, but I'm delighted to welcome Tina Owens, who's the Senior Director of Food and Agriculture Impact at Danone, North America. Stefan Galens is the Research and Field Crops Director at Practical Farmers of Iowa. And Robin Palukas is the Senior Mediator and Program Manager at Meridian Institute. I'd love for each of you to introduce yourselves and provide the audience a sense of where your work is situated, within the food and agriculture realm. And to get us started, Tina, could you provide us a little bit of background on where you are and what you do?
Yes, thank you, Beth, and many thanks to the Ceres and WWF teams for bringing us together today for this conversation. So you mentioned my title. My role sits within the public affairs team, and I am leading industry engagement for regenerative agriculture in North America for Danone. And I focus on opening really big doors for farmers that they would not be able to open at an individual level. So that includes things like conservation innovation grants from NRCS, or impact investing financing that allows them to access low or no cost loans to help with their regenerative transition, which feeds into our soil health program that I'll talk about today.
Terrific. Stefan, can you give us a little bit of background on what you do at Practical Farmers of Iowa?
Sure. Practical Farmers of Iowa, or PFI, as you'll probably hear me refer it as, is a nonprofit farmer-led organization. Our various educational, outreach, and community building efforts aim to equip farmers of all kinds and sizes and types build resilient farms and communities across the state and region. As research director and together with my teammates, I work to empower farmers to generate and share knowledge through timely and relevant farmer-led research. So what does farmer-led mean? That means we go where our farmers go. Our members tell us where to go. And recently that has resulted in a lot of work on soil health and environmental stewardship practices per that farmer interest and across all those various enterprises and sizes and types of farms that we have across the state. So happy to be here and share what we've learned and what we're doing at Practical Farmers.
Great, thank you, Stefan. And Robin, over to you.
Yeah, my name's Robin Plikas. I'm with Meridian Institute, and Meridian focuses on collaboration. We're a mission-driven nonprofit organization, and we bring people together to solve complex or controversial problems that couldn't be solved by a single organization or entity. And a lot of my work centers on sustainability and deforestation-free agriculture supply chains, especially issues of transparency and traceability. And I worked with Kirsten and the rest of the Ceres team on the study that Kirsten shared some highlights on, that it really explored this water quality metrics, sustainable sourcing, and US row crops. And I'll be sharing some additional insights and findings from that study as part of the panel.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much all for providing that background. We have a number of rounds of questions that focus on the interest areas that I outlined just a few minutes ago. Just a reminder for folks who are out there, we do have a chat box, so if you have questions, feel free to submit those. We're curating those, and we will have an opportunity at the end to ask questions of the panelists as well. So to get us started, to set the stage for this kind of work and also to talk about the importance of company engagement, I think I'll ask Robin first a question, leading off of some of the work that Kirsten provided. So Kirsten provided a brief overview of the work you did with Ceres on corporate sustainable commitments for water quality in US row crops. But I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about the findings that resonated with you or that were particularly encouraging. And what are the biggest challenges for companies looking to source sustainably produced crops? And what do you see as opportunities for those companies?
Yeah, great question. And I'm excited to go into a little bit more detail about this. I was thinking about sort of three big areas or key insights from the findings that you might find interesting. The first is that water quality is the central ag-related challenge facing the Mississippi River Basin and a lot of waterways throughout the US and internationally. But water quality is really hard to measure. And therefore, it's really hard to get to specific, meaningful, measurable, sustainable sourcing commitments if it's difficult to measure the item that you're committing to. So as a result, one of the directions we've leaned in the study is to consider proxies for water quality, such as the agriculture practices that are associated with positive water outcomes. And as was just recently discussed by Nicole, there's a lot of co-benefits in this space. So by improving soil health, you're resulting in positive water outcomes. You're also resulting in some soil carbon and some other benefits there. The second thing that I'll mention really quick is, and this is no surprise to the people in this call, but supply chains are really complex. And so getting from an individual farm that's growing soy to the actual end product that's in the supermarket is really complex, and we currently don't have the transparency or the traceability in the supply chain to say this soybean that was sustainably produced is ending up in this final product. And as a result, some companies are finding that it helps to work directly with suppliers, but others, there might be opportunities for companies to collectively work together to sort of raise the bar on sustainability issues or approach these from different ways or tools. And then the third and final thing that I'll say about the study is that we really found that we can't end with sustainable sourcing, and that the most effective or innovative commitments that we were seeing also involved investments in watershed partnerships, investments in the policy environment that's going to support sustainability, or increasing the overall sustainability capacity for improving row crops. And so thinking about those streams in addition to the sustainable sourcing provides a lot of benefit.
Great, thank you very much, Robin. That provides a lot of great context for my next question for Stefan. You know, and particularly as you were talking about practices and how those can be a proxy for water quality. Stefan, you know, how can companies effectively work with farmers to promote adoption of some of these soil health practices, like cover cropping and conservation tillage? And then what are some of the challenges associated with making those kinds of changes? And, you know, the third part of the question is, you know, what kind of strategies does PFI use to encourage adoption, both at the state and regional and maybe the, you know, federal or national level?
Great, I'd be happy to address those. Well, I'll start. Nicole kind of alluded to this, connecting with local suppliers of products, but also connecting and listening to local leaders or groups who are trusted by farmers and can connect companies to both suppliers and farmers on the ground. Local leaders and farmer leaders, kind of farmer champions or early adopters of practices, will know best what soil health or water quality practices are relevant to their regions and systems. There's a lot of different practices that can be used across the globe that improve soil health or water quality. Not all are locally relevant, so it's important to know those kinds of ins and outs. Some of the challenges, they're usually both financial and social, I'll say. Right? Some of these practices are great for the environment, soil, water quality, whatever, but they might not have immediate first-year payback to farmers, even though farmers want to use them to improve their soils, the water quality, or whatnot. Using cover crops or reducing tillage right away, there's a growth curve, there's a learning curve that might not result in vast improvements right away. So certain things that people can do or that help farmers adopt things include cost share, sharing the financial burden of some of those practices, because we might lose a little bit of yield or something like that. And we want to keep people using these practices, not just try it once and get bit and then go back to their same old ways. It also takes guts for farmers to be different in their neighborhoods, to try new things. That social aspect is really important and often neglected. You got to have the farmers that I talk to, these guys and gals, have thick skin for, I'm going to try a cover crop, and I know my neighbors are going to talk about me in the coffee shop, at the gas station, whatever. I think farm companies need to understand that farmers are sometimes sticking their necks out and trying new things, and that we've learned at Practical Farmers that a network of farmers sharing their tactics, their stories, their challenges, their successes and failures is really important for that kind of social support, and important for then scaling up adoption of these kinds of practices, so that people know that they're not alone, that other people are doing this and facing those same things.
Great, thank you so much, Stefan, for that perspective. And, you know, shifting gears just a little bit and pulling back, that's a larger level, I have a question for Tina. As part of your AgWater Challenge goals, Danone North America is a signatory or a participant, actually, of the AgWater Challenge. Danone is committed to developing a time-bound roadmap for agricultural water stewardship. Just can you describe some of the challenges and successes you've experienced as you work towards developing this global policy? And then, if it makes sense, how have some of the things that you've heard from Robin and Stefan aligned with some challenges or opportunities that you've seen?
Yeah, thank you, Beth, for the question. And Stefan, I could echo everything that you stated around the social challenges related to farmer adoption. Bringing it back to Danone for a moment, we're very committed to preserving and renewing water-related ecosystems by respecting the natural water cycle. And we are fully participating in efforts to support the UN Sustainable Development Goal 6, which includes water and agriculture. And at a global level, our responsibility for water-related issues extends all the way to our Chairman and Chief Executive Officer, Emmanuel Faber. It also includes our Executive Committee and our Social Responsibility Committee, which is at the board level. So our global water policy is live now. It was published earlier this year. It's available for anyone who searches under Danone and water policy. One of the challenges we've faced, Beth, to get to the specifics of your question, is how to best access our Scope 3 partners when this includes individual family farms that may or may not be growing crops on land that they directly own. So it changes the dynamics if you own the land that you're growing your crops on to feed your dairy, as opposed to leasing. You may not be as able to invest in the land in the way that personally you might like to. I think it's safe to say the challenges we face are not unique to us. And I noticed in the Ceres report, the 2020 update, it called out the limitations even in current testing technology and the difficulty in connecting outcomes to specific farm activities. We have actually been able to get to the farm level because where we've experienced our success, it's been in large part due to the fact that Danone purchases the bulk of our milk, which is our largest commodity, through relationships that are direct with family farmer partners. We're not buying through a black box commoditized approach, and it unlocks several exciting opportunities for us. And you'll find that when you peel back the layers of large CPGs that are doing this work, one of the first things that you typically do is actually carve out a piece of the commoditized supply chain so that they can unpack the black box and start to figure out where change can be made at the farm level. So with our direct purchasing structure in place, it's allowed us to implement really unique program solutions at an individual farm level and enroll people into our soil health program, which launched in 2018, and which I'll share more detail about in this discussion as it relates to water. So Beth, I'll turn it back over to you at this point.
Great, excellent. So this has been a great first round. And, I think in our next round, we really want to sort of dive in a little bit more into some of these practices in regenerative agriculture, sustainable agriculture, and soil health that can be part of the overall picture of water quality and overall ecosystem health. So Tina, since you just brought up your soil health initiative at Danone, that's really exciting. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about the outcomes of that initiative, as well as some of your aspirational goals that you have.
Yeah, thank you. So that program is pivotal as it relates to our goals around the use of water within agriculture. And we announced in 2018 our intention to spend $6 million on research and soil health pilots. This was originally with our milk farmer partners from 2018 to 2019, but this past year, we've begun to extend it to almonds, and then it will also extend to soy and oats in the coming months. And the goals of this initiative were to determine what the profitability and climate resilience impact was as it relates to farmer conversion to regenerative agriculture practices, which include no-till, crop rotation, cover crops, and more. It also includes captured data on irrigation practices and nutrient runoff into waterways, which is key. So we have annual data where we can see what the impact is as these practices are adopted on farm. And that work is performed by our third-party verifier and partner in this program, Eco Practices. And they're the ones working directly with our farmers to provide technical assistance that's farm-specific, which is important because we know the soil types, the rainfall, the regional considerations, the crop species are specific to each farm. And therefore, the solutions must be tailored to each farm. And because of the information Eco Practices has gathered, we've been able to determine the level of cover crop use, the varieties planted, the amount of soil saved that would have otherwise been erosion loss into waterways, whether the farms are using moisture probes as part of their irrigation process, and more data beyond that. And then there are other outcomes that might be a little less obvious. For example, McCarty Family Farms, which is one of our largest dairy partners, has extracted almost 20 million gallons of water at their milk condensing plant and reused it for irrigation on their fields. So this means less trucks on the road for transportation of milk over to our yogurt plant, but it also shows how water can be recaptured on a dairy and utilized elsewhere within the operation. So when we began in 2018, we had 26,000 acres enrolled. This year we expanded to 75,000 acres. We plan to continue with further expansion, and again, that will include key projects in almonds, oats, and soy. And there's some specific financial programs we've put in place. That's kind of where my role comes in, to incentivize the continued change on farms within our soil health program, and I hope to talk more about those programs in a few minutes. So Beth, back to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That's really a great synopsis and exciting to have 75,000 acres as part of that right now. Robin, you know, in the work that you've done with Ceres, looking at row crop sustainability in the Mississippi watershed, you've suggested a number of practices that promote soil health and water quality improvements, including a number of the ones that Tina was mentioning, and nutrient optimization, crop rotation, conservation tillage, cover crops. You also included some downstream initiatives such as buffer strips, drainage, water management, and bioreactors. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about how these on-farm and downstream practices work to foster a more robust ecosystem, and then maybe a comment or two about, you know, the importance of implementing these types of practices in tandem.
Sure, happy to comment on that. So a lot of those practices mentioned are going to be really effective at the farm level. And I think when you sort of take a step back and think about the millions of farms that make up the Mississippi River Basin, you realize that each farm is making their own decisions at the farm level based on their farm economics, culture, expert advice, all those factors that that we've been talking about. And that it's really important to recognize that even with all companies raising the bar on sustainability and all farmers committing to being as sustainable as possible and adopting some of these practices, there's still going to be situations where there's too much fertilizer applied, or a particular big storm or runoff event is going to release some of the stuff that's been stored in sediment for years, and those types of challenges. So even with sort of an optimal situation and a lot of farms all doing the right thing and pulling in the same direction, there's still going to be these situations where a sub-watershed or a particular region or state is going to have impacts that are sort of larger than can be managed by just those on-farm practices. And this really speaks to the value of watershed partnerships, collaborative groups, these sort of networks of farmers that can really come together and look at solutions that get at both the on-farm practices, but also some of the regional impacts and challenges. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Excellent. That's really, really, really helpful. You know, thinking about, you know, this is a larger ecosystem and the resiliency that you can build into that, not just on farm, but adjacent to the farms. Stefan, you know, this brings me to, you know, a question that I've been sort of dying to ask. And, you know, one is that, you know, there's been a lot of emphasis on water smart agriculture as well as climate smart agriculture. And I wonder, you know, how we should move forward with emphasizing these. Should they come at the expense of each other, or is there a way to combine them in a way that's cohesive as well as beneficial across the ag supply chain?
Well, I guess I'd say most of the practices, excuse me, that Robin and Tina we've been talking about today, they pretty much address both emphases. So they're not really an either or. They really kind of work in tandem on different levels. You know, you think about cover crops and extended rotations. Tina kind of mentioned those. Those can make farms more resilient to extreme weather and climate. They can also reduce pesticide and fertilizer use, which works towards reducing emissions that come from the creation of those chemicals. And then that also works towards improving water quality, because if less of that is being applied, less of that is subject to runoff, like Robin kind of mentioned, in big storm events into water bodies. And then, you know, reducing tillage, conservation or no tillage can improve soil and reduce fossil fuel use because there's less passes across the field. And so that's less fossil fuel emissions. And then if you even want to extend to well-managed grazing systems, that can improve the grass in pastures, and that can improve the soil on that field, which improves the soil's ability to soak up rain, keep nutrients in the field. All these things really kind of, they improve water quality, they improve soil quality, they can work towards improving impact on climate. And it really takes a look at the entire system and not just one thing like changing a crop variety or changing a fertilizer practice. It's a multi-year assessment rather than a year-by-year assessment, which we're usually prone to looking at, particularly in annual crop production. So if you put in a diverse crop rotation with a legume cover crop that fixes nitrogen from the atmosphere, it might take a few years for that payback to that rotation or to that farmer or to that field. It might take 1 or 3 years before we start reaping those things. And so, farmer is outlaying that expense 1 year, he or she might not be expecting an impact for 2 or 3 years down the line. So understanding or rewarding farmers for taking that kind of multi-year approach is probably imperative to getting these things expanded on the landscape.
Excellent, thank you. And, as I'm looking at what our next round of questions is about, it really is about, farmer incentives, but also about collective watershed action. And so, Stefan, I think I'll just stay with you in this next question and ask you another one. And it's a little long, so bear with me. So, through our research and talking with many companies, we've learned that this technical and financial support can significantly help to advance water smart and climate smart agricultural practices. In your work with farmers, what incentive programs have you seen be successful to support the adoption of these practices? And I'm hoping you can highlight some that have been effective with their unique elements, but also maybe offer some suggestions for improvements or even, new programs. Can dream of what would be great to have out there.
Sure. So one of our first projects was with Unilever, who owns Hellmann's mayonnaise, and a lot of the soy grown for the oil going into that mayo comes from Iowa. It's number 2 soy grower in the country behind Illinois. So a lot of soy. And we worked with them, or my colleagues worked with Unilever and then our other suppliers on the ground, ADM, to put in cost share for cover crops in a soy cropping system, and also offering a premium to those farmers who were using that. So it really started kind of a financial incentive, right? One of those challenges I mentioned at the top was financial barriers to adopting new practices, which do cost money to a farmer. So that was working well, but we realized that was a good first step. But to really kind of lock people in and get them into these practices, there was that social aspect as well. We can't just give them money or offer them a premium, but we need to provide that social network, that support group that really PFI thrives on, and we have since we began in the 1980s. And that we needed to think more about how do we help plug these new farmers through this supply chain, and that are new to practical farmers, with our existing membership, our existing support network of farmers who are leading the way using these kinds of practices. Get them together at meetings, field days, get-togethers, socials, all kinds of number of things that myself and my colleagues and teammates at Practical Farmers do to coach each other up, to learn, to have honest conversations about, the ins and outs, the ups and downs of these practices. And so really, it really began, and now that we're doing this with other companies as well, yes, we want to secure cost share for taking that first financial leap, but then also help farmers plug into these social networks and learn they're not alone. There are other people trying these things, and learn the different tactics and strategies for growing these new crops that are new to their rotations, or these new practices that are new to their systems. And so it's really crucial to involve, like kind of Nicole mentioned this at the top, the local organizations or leaders or groups on the ground, the boots on the ground, when trying any kind of incentive program, because those folks might be able to connect those social networks, those farmers of like minds, or farmers that they want to bring on and convince and entice to try something new, and say, hey, there's these guys and gals also trying it. call them up or come to their farm. She can tell you all about how she's doing this really well. So really, we've learned that you can't just, give that carrot of financial support, but plug them into a network. And like all of us, farmers aren't different than, like, we're social beings. We want to be together with people and learn from each other. So that's become really imperative with our efforts.
Terrific. Yeah, thank you so much. So Tina, from the perspective of Danone, the company has pledged to support and scale projects, including, collective action approaches, those that restore freshwater ecosystems. You have some great programs and on-farm ground recharge projects for almond farmers, water and nutrient efficiency technologies that you were talking about with your dairy producers. Can you talk about the ways in which Danone has provided some of the financial and technical support to help farmers in those transitions? And how do you invite the supply chain partners to collaborate locally, sort of to get at what Stefan was talking about in that, kind of boots on the ground aspect? And of course, we'd love to hear about your challenges and lessons learned from that work.
Yeah. So we work with over 700 family farms, and so we consider them to be a close network and have many meetings, even virtually now, to pull them together. Those within the soil health program are interfacing with eco practices on a regular basis to get exposure to what resources are available in their region, or what we can share with them as best practices across our network that can help them. Where we focused on the financial aspects of this work is an important approach when it comes to recruiting farmers from all walks of life into the program. So we've focused on giving farmers insights into how adopting regenerative ag practices, of which positive water outcomes are a byproduct, and can help them with their own climate and financial resilience. So to that end, we have several steps that we've taken. The 2018 announcement of $6 million was specific to technical assistance at farms, providing that full story viewpoint so the farmers know what they can do next. And that's accomplished through the Sustainable Continuous Improvement Plan, called a SKIP plan from Eco Practices, that shows them those top 4 to 6 practices they can work on in the coming crop year and beyond, to continue moving positively across the spectrum. And as Stefan mentioned, actually giving them a multi-year view on what happens if they start to adopt those. Then building upon that, we utilized our $6 million commitment to submit for a conservation innovation grant with the NRCS via our partner, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And we were very fortunate to secure an on-farm pilot grant of $3 million, which increased our budget by 50% from 2020 through 2023. So the grant outcome is meant to culminate in a white paper issued in conjunction with the NRCS, showing what the economic impact is of these on-farm practice changes. And the grant essentially covers operating cost expenses within the field, such as cover crop seed purchases. But again, the list of projects is farm specific. And by covering these costs, it greatly speeds up the farmer's return on investment of making these practice changes. So covering operating costs is only one element of inducing change. We also have to account for the capital expenses, such as a roller crimper to facilitate planting green without tillage. Where possible, we're utilizing grant money to help with these purchases, but this is where on-farm costs can exponentially increase when you look across dozens or hundreds of farms. And so for that reason, we partnered with Replant Capital, which is utilizing impact investing funds to offer up to $20 million in low-cost loans direct to our farming partners over the coming 12 to 18 months. And then it's kind of a buffet. With all of these options in place, we've created the variety of choices for farms in an attempt to account for most or all aspects of the choices they'll be faced with as they continue to convert to regenerative agriculture practices. And then where possible, we're putting real money out on the table of our own to help with adoption. And then not to forget the fact that we have direct relationships and offtake agreements that are multi-year that create a solid base from which farmers feel they can leap into this change with us. So that's probably the best I can do to put it in a nutshell, Beth. Back to you.
Wow, that's a lot to put in a short answer. Thank you so much. And I'll be looking forward to seeing that white paper when it comes out. I'm sure, we'll make sure that our network, let us know, and we'll make sure a network of people knows as well. It sounds really exciting. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Robin, back to you. And, I think, we've been talking a lot about, practice adoption, and you did a lot of analysis of that in the work you did with Ceres. And I'm, wondering if you could explain briefly some of the distinctions that you had among the different commitment types that companies use, and speak to why practice adoption and commitment, along with other critical elements, has shown promise.
Yeah, happy to speak to that. I think this connects some of the themes that we've been hearing throughout this conversation. I think in talking to some of the NGOs or sustainability experts, everyone would really like to see a sort of gold standard company commitment that truly gets at measuring the actual impacts on the ground. So the amount of carbon reduced or the nutrient runoff that's prevented or things like that. But we're just not there with measuring, right? We don't have the tools in place. We can't accurately say that what exactly those changes are and how they're playing out. So in the absence of that ability to make meaningful impact or outcome commitments, then there's a couple of options for sort of proxies. And one of the ones that we also looked at was this measurement proxy. So a lot of companies might make a commitment to start measuring, to use a specific calculator or risk assessment tool to take stock of where they are. And it's a really good first step. I think it can be helpful. There's the old measure what matters, or you'll manage what you measure. So I think that all of those are really important, and it is a really good first step. But what we heard over and over again is companies can't end with measuring, that needs to be the first point, and that then coming up with an implementation plan, thinking through what those next steps are going to be really significant in the long-term outcomes. So that leads us to sort of the third bucket, which is these practice commitments. And these are things like the regenerative agriculture commitments, so X number of acres under regenerative practices, or things like that. And these are really complex because they vary by region. They involve the involvement of lots of middle sort of sustainability experts that can really foster these changes at the farm level. And we ultimately can't say that X number of farmers adopting regenerative ag results in X reduction in nitrates in the river system. But we do know that collectively, a bunch of farmers doing these practices will make a positive difference in water quality, in carbon, and that type of thing. And so this is a really good sort of no risk or low risk now available option that is both meaningful and impactful and results in some positive outcomes.
Great, thank you so much. I just looked at the time, I'm like having so much fun with you guys, and really great information. But I want to make sure we have some time for the companies and who are on the line to ask some questions. And I think what will happen is Kirsten is going to come on. Here she is, and she is going to curate those, and I will. I'll get off as the moderator, but thank you all so much.
Great, thanks so much, Beth. This has been a really great, insightful discussion, and I have been monitoring some of the questions that are coming in. So I'm going to filter through a few of those quickly. So I guess the first one, Stefan, I'll send your way. You've mentioned a few times and others in today's discussion as well that you can't really necessarily say that all of the practices we've talked about work in all contexts. So can you address, are there any unquestionable benefits of some of these practices that we've discussed that are more universal? And also, what more is needed to really make the case for some of these outcomes that we're after, whether they're environmental or business outcomes? Any thoughts on that?
Sure. I'd say any practice that results in more roots in the ground for a longer period of the year is good for keeping soil in place, so reducing soil movement, erosion off the field, and for preventing nutrients like nitrogen or phosphorus from leaving the field and into the waterways. So that's pretty well been established by a lot of scientific literature across the globe, not just in certain regions. When you get to some of the other large claims about some of these practices, those are often regional or climate specific, like improvements to organic matter or soil carbon. So those need to be, I think it's important for companies to understand that just because you do this practice here and you get this result, doesn't mean you do this practice here and get the same level of the result. Right? What might work really well in the mid-Atlantic for improving soil organic matter might not result in the same amount of improvement in organic matter with the same practice in Iowa because of the different soils and climates. But I'd argue that you doing those kinds of things will keep soil in place and nutrients in place, which is ultimately very, very good for water quality. So there are regional scientists, USDA scientists, and university scientists that should be able to parse out some of those grand claims that a lot of us hear, and that frankly farmers hear too, and some of us, wonder about. But again, regional specificity for some of the really grand claims. But nutrients in the water, soil keeping in place, anything to keep roots in the ground year round, that's going to do a lot of good for soil erosion and water quality.
Great points. Thank you. Okay, the next one I think I'm going to send over to Robin. So, we talked a bit about acreage goals and how we, found that some companies, are moving forward with those types of goals. And that's obviously a good start. But do you have thoughts on how companies can ensure these goals are relevant to the particular context? So getting at a bit of what Stefan was just talking about, but how can we really make sure that we have that relevance to the local setting?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And actually, Stefan's probably a good one to also weigh in on this, because my first suggestion would be work with organizations like Practical Farmers of Iowa, or your local ag extension agents, or your local universities, and that they can help kind of differentiate. There was some really interesting modeling work that's going on that can make the connection between what is being sourced by which companies and what areas might have the biggest impact. And I think that thinking through, we're never going to be able to, well, I won't say never. Right now with the current technology, we can't directly link what's happening on one farm to what a company is purchasing. But I think that we can get a sense of, we're generally sourcing a lot of this from this area, and this watershed is really impaired, and putting some energy into that particular watershed is going to make a significant difference. So kind of using some of those modeling tools to hone in on the biggest impacts, I think makes a lot of sense. And then again, partnerships, working with local experts and the people that have the ear of the farmers, I think is probably some good starting points for some of that.
Yep, great points. Thanks, Robin. Okay, so I think we only have time for one last question, and I'm going to take a bit of a liberty as the moderator for this one, because I think it's a nice way to end the discussion. So Tina, over to you. We talked about your Danone's participation in the AgWater Challenge and some of the results of the commitments you made. So just wanted to get a few thoughts on, why Danone engaged on the AgWater Challenge, and also, are there any other similar collaborative programs that have been helpful in your journey to a sustainable supply chain that you'd like to share? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks, Kirsten. And people may not be aware of this, but we are the world's largest B Corp. Danone North America is $6 billion in revenue. And we have a triple bottom line approach. So people, planet, and profit is mandated within our articles of incorporation. And so we'd like to think we do business in a bit of a different way. That said, we've also made some other public commitments around sustainable dairy. So our Horizon Organic brand, the largest milk brand in the US, is committed to being beyond carbon neutral to what we're calling carbon positive, for the positive impact by 2025. And so, we're looking at how we can engage farmers for solar, lagoon covers, wind energy, and other outcomes on the farm. So it goes beyond water to encompass really everything that is happening within our Scope 3 emissions. And I believe it's 89% of our water footprint is within agriculture. And so it is critically important that we're addressing that. There's no way we can make it up somewhere else in our supply chain. And so it's wonderful to have collaborations with Ceres, with WWF, to help us when we design those programs, so that we're going in with the maximum impact in mind from the beginning, but also doing it in a way that's recognizable within the industry so others can learn from what we're doing and follow us with their own programs. Happy to collaborate with anyone who's on this discussion that would like to know more. And I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with all of you today. Thanks, Kirsten.
Great, thank you. And I think that's a great note to end on. And unfortunately, we are out of time. Could go on forever with this discussion, but I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We hope you leave today's discussion with some new ideas and strategies for possible partnerships or practices in your journey. And just a huge thank you to our excellent speakers today. Really appreciate all your amazing insights. And lastly, we hope you will consider joining us on this new iteration of the AgWater Challenge. We're really excited about it, and we hope you are too. So please be in touch, or we'll be in touch. And again, thank you so much for joining us today, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Kirsten.